Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's MarkMonitor's webinar, ICANN 53 Buenos Aires Week Recap, where we'll be reviewing the highlights from the meeting. I'm Gina LaFlora of MarkMonitor. Now, before we begin our presentation, I'd like to run everyone through a few housekeeping items. During today's webinar, all participants' lines will be muted to ensure there is no background noise. Following our presentation, we will be holding a Q&A session. If you have a question at any time for our speaker during the presentation, feel free to submit it using the Q&A tab located on your screen. You can also submit your questions at the end of the session. For any questions our speakers won't have time to answer today, we'll make sure to follow up with you after the event. We are recording today's webinar, and we plan to send out a follow-up email to all registrants with a link to the recording and presentation slides within the next couple of days. With that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers for today's presentation. We are joined by MarkMonitor Domain Management and gTLD experts, Elisa Cooper and Matt Serlin. Elisa Cooper is Vice President of Product Marketing for MarkMonitor. With 13 years of direct experience, she is an expert in the field of online brand protection and domain name management. Elisa has worked closely with many Fortune 1000 companies in assisting with domain and brand protection policy development. She has spoken and written extensively on these topics and is the chair of ICANN's business constituency and is an active member of the International Anti-Counterfeiting Coalition and the Online Trust Alliance. Matt Serlin is Vice President of Global Client Services for MarkMonitor. He brings over 13 years of experience in the domain name industry and brand protection. He is responsible for all facets of the company's global customer service and support operations for domain name, brand protection, and anti-piracy services, including client, third-party registry, and registrar relationships. As a recognized authority on domain name issues, Matt regularly advocates on behalf of corporate brand holders at ICANN meetings, where he previously served on the executive committee of the Registrar Stakeholder Group. He also serves as a senior domain name consultant, working with MarkMonitor clients on portfolio consolidation, as well as domain name and online brand protection strategy development. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Elisa and Matt to get us started.
Thanks, Gina, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So we have a lot of material to cover. We're going to dive right in, and as we said at the top, we definitely want to make sure we leave time for Q&A. So as we go along, please enter any questions you want to get to in the Q&A box down in the bottom of your screen there. So as you can see, we're going to just give a brief overview of the recent ICANN meeting down in Buenos Aires, talk, of course, about everyone's favorite topic, which is the new gTLD program update. A little bit about some of the things we're seeing with the registry operators that were discussed at ICANN that we think are potentially problematic. And then on one of the most contentious policy issues that's going on at ICANN right now, which is the privacy proxy accreditation process. And then Elisa is going to talk about the IANA transition, ICANN accountability, and then the government advisory communique, and then we'll end, of course, as we always do, with how you can become involved. So with that, we'll jump right in. So we got back from Buenos Aires a few weeks ago, and though overall participation was down from the Singapore event, I actually feel really positive about the continuation of large corporations that continue to show up and participate, both from a policy perspective in terms of things like the business constituency and the intellectual property constituency, but also obviously as we have corporations that are now registry operators, you see corporations playing in the registry space as well. So things like the brand registry group really has great participation. So, you know, for folks that have been attending ICANN for a large number of years, and really, you know, if you've attended any of these webinars, you've heard us kind of talk about how you can become involved, and really it's been rewarding to see people kind of heed that advice, and so we continue to see that. You know, one of the things that was really kind of hanging over the meeting in general was an announcement by ICANN CEO Fadi Shahadi, really just several weeks before the meeting, that his tenure would be coming to an end earlier than his contract was up. So there was a lot of talk, actually quite frank talk, I think, from Fadi about his experience and his perspective. You know, he arguably kind of took ICANN through one of its most pivotal times in its history, really, if you look at all of the things that took place under his leadership, things like, the actual launch of the new gTLD program and the delegation of new TLDs, things like the IANA transition that really started under his watch. And so, he was really reflective about really the role of the ICANN CEO. And he made a comment that struck me, that really the ICANN CEO role is really unlike any traditional CEO role that's out there. It's really he broke it down into three parts, which I think kind of frames ICANN really well. So on the one hand, you've got, you are the CEO of a corporation. ICANN's a, several $100 million corporation with a global staff, and so all the things that come along with being a traditional CEO on one hand. But then you're sort of a political ambassador as well. And he talked about a lot of the time that he spends meeting with politicians in various countries, talking about internet governance and those various things. And then the final sort of piece to the CEO role is this interaction with the community. And so, ICANN is really designed to be a bottoms-up, multi-stakeholder model, and the CEO is sort of a pivotal piece in that. So it was really interesting to sort of hear his perspectives, and I think it'll be very interesting to see who the next CEO is and how that plays to the next sort of phase in ICANN's evolution. And then obviously, and Elisa will spend a fair amount of time talking about this, but really was a lot of focus both on the IANA transition and the functions that IANA performs from a technical level, but also overall ICANN accountability, which the two are tied together. So with that, I get the luxury of talking about the new gTLD program, and so we're going to run through some information here. So as you can see, we're really sort of getting down to the last TLDs to be contracted. You can see there's really only about 40 or so that have yet to enter the contracting process, about 250 or so that are in that contracting phase, and these are numbers that are quite frankly changing every day. ICANN is adding TLDs into the root zone pretty much every day at this point. And so that 660 number, I'm sure by now, has increased a fair amount. So you can see we're kind of moving through the program relatively smoothly in terms of a delegation standpoint. So you can see here the geographical breakdown with a large concentration in North America and Europe. ICANN was initially sort of came under some criticism for the lack of real meaningful numbers coming out of the developing world. So you can see here only, a handful of TLDs delegated from Africa, and still a relatively small number from the Latin America and Caribbean regions as well. So, as we talk about going into the next round, and I just felt everyone on the phone cringe a little bit, but yes, there will be a next round. It'll be interesting to see what additional kind of outreach efforts ICANN and the stakeholders do to the developing economies around the world to see if that number will come up in future rounds. So you can see here, and again, this is, another one of those numbers that, probably by today potentially is outdated. I think it's actually up to 6.4 million maybe. But steady increase in the numbers of new gTLD registrations that we see. And we have a breakdown on the next slide of sort of how those break down. So you can see, and we've actually come past the sort of initial renewal point. So, the TLDs that launched early on in the process have now gone through that one-year renewal, which is, significant in the sense that a lot of, if you take a look at .xyz, for example, which initially were given away for free, which is why they were, the largest TLD for a long time, still are. And so as these TLDs come into that one-year anniversary period, I think there's a lot of focus not only on how the renewals are performing, and several of the registry operators have actually openly talked about how their renewals compare to what their expectations were and compare to things like .com and things like that. But then we're also seeing, and we saw actually at ICANN, that I think that's also a point in time where some of these registry operators, quite frankly, are looking around and going, this is not financially viable for me to continue. And so there's been a number of, I think there were probably 3 or 4 TLDs that changed hands while we were in Buenos Aires that were sold to one party or another, and there were a number of sort of open discussions about, various registry operators looking to sort of, acquire TLDs that might not be living up to what the initial expectations were, what the financial projections were. And so it'll be interesting to see, as we move into what's now year 2 and beyond, I think, frankly, we're going to see some of that increase, so that we'll see people that frankly just realize that, the niche TLD, and I'm going to refrain from calling out any of them on this call, but, those really targeted, specialized TLDs that are unrestricted. So I'm not talking about things like .bank, where there's an actual, defined market, and actually I think they're doing a lot of good things. I'm talking about more of the sort of generic word, unrestricted ones that have, if after year 1 and year 2, you've got less than 1,000 domains in those zones. I think those are some of the ones where we'll start to see some activity, and those will be the ones that I think potentially will change hands. So that was the sort of breakdown of what's out in the general population. And if you look here at just what's popular amongst corporate entities, you can see, those top 3. I would venture to say 99.9% of the registrations in those TLDs, certainly by corporate clients, are strictly for defensive purposes. And so, previously you had things that you could make, a case for something like a .reviews. People could register those for real purposes, for marketing use, for forum sites, things like that, .nyc support, things like that. But, those top 3 and the top 2, .porn and .sox, are probably right neck and neck. Obviously, there was a lot of discussion around .sox, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the points specifically with .sox and others. But either despite that or because of that, frankly, it really was a TLD that I think ultimately, actually with all of these, the internal discussions about, quite frankly, it just isn't worth it for us to run the risk of having, a third party go out and register our name and have it associated with something like .porn or .adult. And so we saw a lot of activity by corporate clients specifically in those TLDs. So, I kind of alluded to it just now specifically to .sox, but there was a fair amount of discussion at ICANN about, suspect registry practices, things that may not specifically be addressed in the registry agreement with ICANN, but from our perspective, and I think from a number of other people's perspective, really not in the spirit of the TLD program. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. So, issues related to sunrise periods. And so, the goal of a sunrise period is, and always has been, for trademark holders to have, basically the first bite at the apple, the first opportunity to register their brand names, their company names in a TLD before the general public. That's, that's for the 13 years I've been in this industry, that's always what a sunrise period has been. That's why the Trademark Clearinghouse was created. And so, we've seen a lot of issues with specifically to the sunrise periods, either where, the reserved names that are released after the sunrise period closes that are never subject to sort of that opportunity, or we've seen TLDs that don't accredit registrars during a sunrise period, obviously making it challenging for a brand holder to register a name in the sunrise period. And so, those are a handful of issues. And really, when you talk to the ICANN compliance folks, their charge really is to enforce the legal agreement between ICANN and the registry operators. And so, they are looking at some of these things going, okay, well, what is the language in the actual agreement, and where is the specific violation? What specific clause of the agreement is being violated? And so I think there's been a lot of discussion about, is this specifically a contract violation, or is this just something that, is a new business opportunity that no one has done before, and so people look at it and question it rightly. And so I think that's kind of what a lot of the discussion is about now. And the final thing here is universal acceptance. And so this is the notion that a lot of the technology platforms that are deployed around the world, quite frankly, don't support new TLDs yet. So things like email forms, where the form is hard-coded to only accept a 3-letter TLD. And so if my new email address is me@mattserlin.email, a lot of online web forms won't accept that. So a lot of talk around universal acceptance and how we get these TLDs to actually be used out in the industry. So one of, outside of the sort of sunrise issues that I just talked about, clearly some kind of pricing trends that we and the majority of our clients believe are problematic. And, I alluded to .sox earlier. They were probably the poster child for this, in the sense that, again, different model than we've seen before, this notion of premium names both during and after the sunrise, frankly, where, if I'm a brand holder, so if MarkMonitor is registering MarkMonitor.sox, either in the sunrise or general availability, we would pay a higher price than if I, as an individual, were to go out and register MarkMonitor.sox. And so, clearly that's been an ongoing discussion. There were hearings in the U.S. and the Hill about it. The Canadian folks took a look at that from a consumer protection standpoint. So there was just a lot of noise about that, and ultimately, as we sort of had predicted, it really went through without any ramifications. But we have now since seen on top of that some additional registries that are really sort of emulating that same sort of model in one flavor or another. So you can see here, for the .date, .faith, and .review, they have a higher price simply just for that first year, and then after that it normalizes. And in talking to, listening to some of the registry operators, they'll say that they're trying to do that to deter people from squatting on the names, is that they price those higher, but it really, from our standpoint, is unfair if the brand holder is the one that's trying to register the name. It really is unequal treatment. And so there was a lot of discussion about, while the ICANN agreement in and of itself doesn't specifically speak to pricing issues, there are sort of non-discriminatory clauses in there. And so there was discussion in Buenos Aires if those discrimination clauses is potentially something that can be looked at in terms of these kind of pricing issues. So you can see, as we, we're kind of going down multiple tracks. There are still TLDs left to be delegated, so we're still kind of marching forward on that. But then there's this sort of future rounds. And before we get to those future rounds, you can see here, there's a large number of reviews of this existing round that will take place, and it actually already started. And so you can see here the rights protection mechanism is going to be starting the second half of this year. But the implementation review, the consumer survey, the economic studies, these are sort of going on in parallel while the TLDs are still being delegated. So, while we've got a set of issues that we've already identified, one of the concerns is that, until all the TLDs are delegated and have gone through their sort of launch process, we might not see all the issues that we eventually want to raise. And so, it's important to note that these reviews are going on. As always with ICANN, there will be an opportunity to comment. And so, I would encourage you both through, the advocacy that we do at ICANN, through the business constituency and our other work there, but also on your own to try to pay attention to these reviews. Submit comments about your perspective, your experience, things that your company thinks are problematic, based on what you've seen already, so that we can maybe try to address some of this stuff in future rounds. So with that, I'm going to move on just real briefly before I pass it over to Elisa to talk about this privacy proxy controversy. So this really was born out of the 2013 Registrar Accreditation Agreement negotiation with ICANN. Part of that agreement stipulates that ICANN and the community will develop a policy and a accreditation program for privacy and proxy providers. And for those of you that may not be aware, privacy and proxy is the ability to register a domain name and use not another company's, but either a company specifically set up for proxy registrations. GoDaddy runs domains by proxy, which is a large proxy provider. We offer it through our services as well. So it really just shields the actual end registrant from revealing details and who is. And so ultimately what we want is, first of all, we want that underlying who is information to be validated. So just like, who is information today is validated by either phone or email, we think that underlying information should be confirmed. And then we also think that there should be responsibility on the privacy proxy provider to both be able to contact the end registrant and also be able to give them pass-through information requests to them that they get on their behalf. So this really was an issue that was discussed a lot at ICANN. It's out for public comment. I think actually the public comment ends today. One of the sort of more controversial pieces is that this notion that people, domain names that are tied to financial transactions really should not be able to hide behind privacy proxy. And there are myriad issues with that. We recognize that fully, and the community will have to work further to sort that out. And again, I think there's been a lot of discussion and a lot specifically on the sort of lack of ability for individuals to not participate in privacy proxy. That really isn't the intent of this sort of opinion that was put forth. But again, as the community goes through, this will definitely be something that will impact anyone that uses privacy and proxy registrations. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to my effervescent colleague, Elisa Cooper here, to talk through some big topics at ICANN. And again, if you've got questions both about the stuff that I've covered and about the material that Elisa will go through, please remember to use that Q&A box. We will definitely leave time at the end for that. Elisa?
Thanks, Matt. That was an excellent overview of really what happened at the meeting in Buenos Aires. What I'd like to do now is really to talk about where we're at with the IANA transition and this whole ICANN accountability working group that's been in effect for some time now and working very diligently to put into place some new mechanisms to really hold ICANN accountable, especially given this transition. So I want to back up and just give some definitions. I know we've talked in past webinars about, what is IANA and what does this all really mean. And for those of you who are attending for the first time, I want to go through that just pretty quickly. So what happened was, for some time, the U.S. government has actually held a contract for some of the key Internet domain name functions, and that was done through NTIA. Due to some pressure, I believe, that the U.S. government was facing, a lot of it having to do with the Snowden revelations, the NTIA decided that they really did not want to be the owner of that contract anymore and that they wanted to transition that contract to a multi-stakeholder group. And so the NTIA came to ICANN and asked ICANN to convene a multi-stakeholder group to develop a proposal for how the IANA functions would be managed in the future. And so now, what are the IANA functions exactly? Well, in essence, it's really four different things. It's really the coordination of Internet protocol parameters. It's the changing of root zone information. It's the allocation of IP numbering resources. And then some other services related to the management of the .ARPA and .INT top-level domains. So it's really these four things. But the reason it's important is, the IANA functions are the functions that really put new TLDs into the actual root. They are the ones that maintain the database. So when a new TLD is delegated, IANA is directed to go ahead and add new TLDs. And when there's a change to an existing TLD, a ccTLD for instance, and there's some change to that, again, IANA is the organization that implements those changes in the database, what they call the root zone, and that information propagates out. That's what enables you to actually type in a domain name and be able to find where that domain name is resolving by knowing where the registry resides, and then by the authoritative information that's resolving and being provided by the registries is then giving you directions where that IP address actually is, so you're able to actually resolve to a website. So it is important. It's a very critical function, but it is also very technical. And, this has been going on. The arrangement that the U.S. government has had for many years over this sort of technical functionality has really worked smoothly, seamlessly. You probably didn't even know it was in existence. And really that's what we want to have going forward. We want this to be seamless and smooth, and we want to experience the same SLAs that we've had so far. When we make a change and move this to some other multi-stakeholder group to be responsible for the IANA functions, we want the same levels of service to exist. Now, in order for the transition to occur, the U.S. government said that there must be 4 conditions met. And those 4 conditions are, in order for the transition to occur to this multi-stakeholder model, is that it must support and enhance the model of stakeholder. It must make sure that we maintain the security, stability, and resiliency of the domain name system, that we are meeting the SLAs and the expectations of global customers and partners of the IANA services, and that it continues to maintain the openness of the internet. And to me, that's really critical because, again, this is the technical function of updating the root zone so that TLDs actually resolve. If, for some reason, this capability that's being provided by this, whoever takes over the IANA functions were to be captured by a particular government, and a particular government said, oh no, we don't want this TLD to resolve, or we don't like these adult-themed TLDs, do not allow those to resolve, that would be an issue. And so that's why it is so important that whatever mechanism is put into place is really part of this multi-stakeholder model. And the reason, the multi-stakeholder model is so important, and why, here at MarkMonitor we are a very strong supporter and advocate to it, is that it allows for all voices to be heard, especially those of the private sector and business. So that said, I want to share with you sort of where we're at in the actual process. So if you see up here in the left-hand corner, IANA, it was announced that the IANA functions would be transitioned. The NTIA made that announcement. They set forth their criteria. And again, they asked ICANN to convene a multi-stakeholder approach to determining sort of how the new IANA functions will be handled. At the same time, it became very apparent that we also needed to implement some new accountability mechanisms to go along with this new group that would be actually completing the IANA function. So you can see here there were 2 groups that were convened with ICANN having oversight and helping to facilitate. There was the IANA coordination group and the cross-community working group. Now, the IANA coordination group is really the group that was dedicated and focused on sort of laying out how the process should work, how things should move once the transition occurred. Whereas the cross-community working group was the group that was really thinking about what kinds of accountability measures need to be implemented, what are the worst-case scenarios, how could they be handled. So from those 2 groups, there'll be proposals from both. They will go ahead to the board, and then they will be presented to the NTIA. And it will be up to the NTIA to either accept the recommendations, and assuming that they meet all of the criteria that they had laid out, then they will be accepted. I think we feel that at this time it'll probably be a year until we are at the actual transition. And so it's very interesting because, clearly the ICANN CEO will already have left us by that point. And it's also very important, I think, that, the transition occur before the next administration takes seat in the U.S. government, because that could have some very serious ramifications. But, I think, the feeling was that we would have been a little bit further along in the process. But I can tell you, knowing some of the people that are working on this, this has taken a tremendous effort. And I think, all of us in the community are very appreciative for all the work that they've done. Now, let's just kind of talk quickly about what the transition requirements are. And I've already touched a little bit on each of these. But definitely we need a contract and functionality for these IANA capabilities to work in a very similar way to the way that they've worked today. We need to have those accountability measures in place, and especially with respect to the IANA functions, again, those technical capabilities that the IANA functions are covering. We need to make sure that there's insulation between the operational functions of IANA and any sort of policy making. There needs to be a clear delineation between those 2. We cannot have the group that is now responsible for the IANA functions creating or implementing any new rather I should just say creating new policy. We need to make sure that there is a clearly defined mechanism to change any of the information in the root zone. Again, so if information is being changed or added, there needs to be a very clearly defined mechanism that designates when that happens, how that happens, what the requirements are. We need to make sure, of course, there's adequate funding to support, and that if there is the need to change the operator of the IANA functions, this yet to be defined new approach for managing them, that if there is a change, that it must be a multi-stakeholder community that convenes to assist in helping to make that actual recommendation for what the change should be. Now, kind of shifting gears a little bit in terms of, how we're going to go about implementing and overseeing these new accountability measures, what has been proposed is something called the membership model, or an enhanced membership model. And really, it's a group that's comprised of different members from across the ICANN community and across the different stakeholders. And so you can see sort of laid out here at the bottom some of the different supporting organizations that would have a seat. So the country code name supporting organizations, the generic name supporting organizations, the security and stability, the at-large, the governmental advisory, and the addressing supporting organizations. Now, it's not clear yet whether actually all of the different stakeholders will want to participate. And I think I've heard that there are some that feel that they may not be able to participate or do not want to participate in this particular membership model. But this would be the group that would be helping to sort of check and make sure that if there are issues, that they would be the group to vote and determine whether or not some action would need to be taken. So in terms of the timing, there's still a fair amount of work yet to be done. I think, we're hoping that by ICANN 56 that there would be a transfer of the model, and so it's something that, again, is taking a lot of the air out of the room at ICANN. And again, it is very important because we definitely need to make sure whoever is handling these IANA functions is, not in there making new policy themselves, and that we've got the right kind of accountability mechanisms in place, given that, no longer, is the technical coordination overseen and contracted through the U.S. government. So we'll see. I'm very hopeful, I think, and most people are very hopeful that we'll be able to complete this hopefully within a year or so. So moving on, I also want to talk a little bit about the Governmental Advisory Committee and their communique. Just to give a little background, now, the Governmental Advisory Committee is a very influential stakeholder within the ICANN community. And the reason that they're so important and so influential is that this is the group that is representing world governments. And there's always been a concern that if world governments are not happy with the process and do not partake and not actively engaged within ICANN, that they could potentially want to participate elsewhere. And the big concern is, that they would want to participate perhaps, somewhere else, and that would definitely provide issues possibly where, if they're participating elsewhere, that governments would have a much stronger input. And as you know, not all governments value free speech and freedom of the internet in the way that we do, especially within the ICANN model. So there is definitely a concern that, we keep the governments informed and engaged, and we work with them and we listen to them. And so there's always that big desire to do that. So at the end of every ICANN meeting, the Governmental Advisory Committee issues their official communique, and this is where they lay out basically areas where they still have questions, where they want the ICANN board to act, where they're asking for further information. And so in this particular communique, they covered a number of different items. And the first one being of great significance, actually, to .brand registries. So this is the development of a database that the GAC is supporting. And in this database, it would clearly identify whether or not a .brand registry, if they wanted to operate a two-letter country code at the second level, so that they would have, for instance, to the left of the dot, a country code, and to the right of the dot, their .brand TLD, whether or not the country that corresponds to that country code would be amenable to that, whether they would have special requirements, whether or not they would not allow it under any circumstance, or whether they have no issue to it at all. And this is going to be very important because I do know that there are many .brand registries who have great interest in running either two-letter country codes as second-level registrations or country or territory names to the left of the dot. But in order to be able to do that, as part of the program, it was a requirement that the registries got approval from all of the different countries. And so hopefully this will streamline the process. And they are hoping to actually have this database completed by the end of July. Now, I think it is a pretty major undertaking, and we'll have to see whether or not that comes to fruition, whether it's totally completed. But I do think it will be extremely helpful for any of the .brand registries to know whether or not they'll be able to operate a country name or a territory name or a country code to the left of the dot. The other area that the GAC was very focused on and remains to be very focused on is around safeguards for the new gTLD registries, particularly around highly regulated sectors. Some of them, like .bank, have done an outstanding job in terms of on their own employing verification and validation measures to ensure that, for instance, only legitimate banks are allowed to have a registration. Now, the GAC had long sought for all of the highly regulated TLDs to have a uniform approach and for that to be laid out for them. But in the absence of that, the GAC is sort of asking that ICANN create a list of commended registries like .bank to show what some of the best practices are for what kinds of things some of these highly regulated strings could ask for in terms of verifying the legitimacy of a particular registrant. Interestingly, the GAC also asked for an assessment of abusive registrations that have already occurred. And so I'm very hopeful that ICANN will comply and will provide that information to the GAC. I think that would be very helpful information for the community to see in general. They're also asking, though, for ICANN to create a scorecard and to clearly identify, of the recommendations that the GAC had put forward, which ones have been adhered to, which ones are sort of in progress, and which ones have been rejected. That's a method that the GAC has used a number of times to create these so-called scorecards to sort of measure when they've asked for something, how well ICANN has responded to the requests. So that will be interesting to see as well. Also, still under discussion and of concern to the GAC are protections in the new gTLDs for IGOs, and not just for the full names of IGOs, but for acronyms that correspond to the IGOs. And the reason that's a bit of an issue for some brands is that some of these IGO acronyms are also acronyms for companies and brands, and in some cases, the acronyms themselves are brands and trademarks. So, for instance, some of the IGOs that, they're asking for protections are, for instance, this International Sugar Organization, and the acronym being ISO. Probably most of us on this call know ISO as the standards organization and not the International Sugar Organization. And so that's just an example. There are others as well. ECO is another good example. So at this point, there will be no registrations to the left of the dot with the string ECO, even though, most of us, I personally was not familiar with the Economic Cooperation Organization. I'm sure there are companies out there that would be interested possibly in having a registration for ECO. So the GAC is asking that the protections that exist today, which is that these are not allowed for registrations, that those remain in place until this is all sorted out. And then the last area where they've expressed concern is around the community priority evaluations. And so let me take you back just a little bit. During the new gTLD program, there were two types of TLDs that could be submitted to become registries. There was sort of the standard type of TLD, and then you could apply for a community-based TLD. And if it was a community TLD, you had to meet certain requirements, meaning you had support from the community, that the TLD, had a nexus to the name of the community, and there were a number of other items as well. And so there's sort of tests that you would have to reach a certain score in order to actually qualify for community. Now, this test or evaluation would only occur, though, if you had two strings that were in contention for the same TLD, and one was deemed to be community and the other was not, because the community TLDs were given priority or preference over the standard type TLDs. And so the GAC is concerned that this test and evaluation that was created to determine whether or not a TLD was truly a community TLD and was representative of the community, they're concerned that this has not met the expectations of the applicant. So the ombudsman was brought in, and there is expected to be a report from him that would be presented in Dublin. So that was sort of the last area of concern that the GAC had. And again, you know, the ICANN board takes all of this information very seriously because, again, the GAC does have so much power. So I know we've covered a ton of information, and what I want to do now is sort of talk about how you can become involved. And, you know, certainly there's lots of information that's always available through ICANN. I think they've really stepped up their outreach. And so if you're not interested in really becoming actively engaged, clearly there are a number of social media sites and the ICANN website itself, which can provide some very good information, although it can also be quite confusing. I would ask companies to definitely consider active participation within ICANN, and I think the business constituency is an excellent place for companies to consider joining. This is really the voice of business users on the internet. They are concerned really with three different objectives. One, they are concerned and really focused on developing policy that ensures that the internet is a safe place for businesses and their consumers. Two, that the supply of registries and registrars remains competitive. And third, this is very important, that from a technical perspective, that the domain name system remains secure, stable, and resilient. So that's really the focus of the business constituency. And, you know, again, you participate with the constituency, you have an opportunity to get a better understanding of exactly what's going on, help in drafting comments. And, you know, there's so much going on that this is a good way to get a good understanding of what all is going on, and then really focus on any of the areas that are like particular interest to you. So if anyone on this call has any interest at all in joining the business constituency, please do reach out to me. We would love to have you participate. Another good place to participate is also the intellectual property constituency, and MarkMonitor also participates with them as well. Their focus is different in that their focus is really on IP issues, trademark, copyright issues, and the protection of those rights. But that's also another group that provides very good work and is very focused on protecting brands. And then finally, if you are a registry, I think the brand registry group is an excellent place to engage. That's a good opportunity to network with others who are facing similar issues. They've done some really fantastic work as well. And so those are really three areas that if you want to become more engaged, I would really highly recommend taking a closer look at. But with that said, let me go ahead. I want to open it up for Q&A. I see that we already have some questions in the Q&A box, and I'm just going to start and work through the questions. We have a little bit of time, and so hopefully we can get through all of them. So the first question is around, do you have any intelligence or information in as far as how the 6.4 million new domain names are registered against new gTLDs being used, and are they being used at all? How many of them were registered as defensive registrations only? Well, I think I can answer that a couple of different ways. Now, I think according to NTLD stats, you know, they've got some interesting stats, and that's a great resource, and I would recommend if folks are interested in seeing what the popularity of TLDs are, that's a great place to go. That's ntldStats.com. But according to the work they've done, they're saying that about 58% of new gTLD registered are parked. Now that's across, you know, all registrations. But let me talk to you about what I think is going on with corporate registrations. And that is, you know, for the most part, you know, very, very few of these registrations are being registered with the intent of actually using them. And I think that's kind of evidenced by the fact that the top three sort of corporate registrations in the new gTLDs are, porn, sucks, and adult. Those are not TLDs that are being used by corporations. I think that could change. We've seen some interesting things. We've seen, for instance, the first use of a .movie registration, in a very commercial way, very widespread. So I think, that's positive. Things could change. But I guess to answer your question, when it comes to corporations, the vast majority of registrations are really still defensive. And I don't know, Matt, if you have anything to add to that.
I agree with you, Elisa, in terms of corporations. Certainly, we've seen some here and there that are being used, but I actually, and it's not big numbers. We're talking 6.4 million domains registered, or 6.2, whatever it is. But I've seen a list of 50 or 100 sites that are sort of case studies of people that moved away from a .com or a .net and to a .photography or a .something else. And so I think, we're starting to see a little bit more of it. And actually, even just out in my sort of day-to-day life, I've seen, handfuls, a smattering here and there. But, remember, we're really just a year into this. And, I think that there's not this sort of critical mass of awareness in the general public. Those of us that are in the industry obviously are used to seeing new TLDs, but I think it'll take certainly some more time.
Here's another question about privacy and proxy. Is there currently any requirement on a privacy registrar to disclose the underlying information upon receipt of a valid request?
No. So right now, privacy proxy, though something that is clearly acknowledged as a service that does take place and does occur within the industry, there actually aren't any requirements for privacy and proxy registrations. It really was a service that was created and born, several years ago, and there isn't any specific ICANN policy requirements around it. And so that's kind of the purpose of this working group in this policy development process, is to actually develop the policy around what those requirements on those providers would be. But currently, there is nothing in place.
Let's see, and just flipping through here, we've got a few questions. So another question I have is, when do you think the next round of new gTLDs will take place?
Well, if I were a betting man, and
we know you are.
We know I am. It will certainly not be before 2018. Other than that, I wouldn't put my hard-earned money on anything. But I would say it's 2018 to 2019, somewhere in that range. I don't know if you want to completely disagree.
No, I think that's probably right.
Okay.
Let's see, another question we have. What, if any, material changes would you expect for the next round of new gTLDs? Well, I can tell you that, I'll take this question next.
Sure.
At the ICANN meeting, there was a lot of discussion around some of the practices that we're seeing in terms of the sort of extortionate pricing for trademark owners. And while that's a very difficult thing, if we start getting into pricing, I think there will definitely be an attempt with all of the reviews, and to develop some type of policy, something. I think there will be a tremendous focus on that. Now the question is whether that will actually get implemented. I just don't know. The way things are stacked at ICANN, where you've got the registries and registrars on one side always voting sort of as a block, and then on the other side, the non-contracted parties don't always agree with each other. It's very difficult to get that kind of policy put into place, but I can tell you I'm sure it's going to be a hot button, and one that the business constituency likely, and I'm sure that the intellectual property constituency will be very interested in weighing in on.
Yeah, no, I just to add, I'd agree with that. I think the issues that we highlighted around the sunrise operations and how things come off of this whole notion of premium names, reserved names, how those are treated when they come off of those lists, how they get added onto those lists. And so again, to the extent that you or your companies have perspectives on this stuff, I really would encourage you to submit comments during the public comment period of those reviews, because frankly, that's how this stuff will get on the table for the next round of TLDs. So I think that's critical.
All right. Definitely have time for some additional questions. So if you enter your question into the Q&A box, we'll be sure to answer it. Let's see, I've got another one here. And it is, what type of CEO do you think they will be looking to hire?
I don't know. I'll take my stab at it. And just to be clear, I'm not throwing my hat in the ring at all. There was a lot of discussion about, whether or not they look for someone that's a quote-unquote insider, right? So someone that's involved in the community today, either actually working at ICANN or at another company within the sort of industry, or if they go from the outside. My personal opinion, and my gut tells me that they actually probably will go with someone that's currently involved in the industry. I think, they're at such a critical junction, and certainly with the IANA transition looming, I think that it would behoove them to bring someone in that doesn't have that kind of long ramp up time. And actually, Fadi talked about this in Buenos Aires, is that it took him a fair amount of time to sort of understand the dynamics of ICANN, and as I mentioned earlier, there's sort of three roles that he has as CEO, and so my gut tells me that they'll bring someone in from the inside. At least I don't know. Not that I'm putting your name in there.
Well, I think that's right. I also have a sense that they could be looking to bring someone, even just to kind of finish out his term, and then perhaps they would do a broader search outside. But I do think they're at a very critical juncture, and somebody who's sort of aware of all the inner workings, might make sense for them. But I do know, this is a big, important, actually very difficult job, and it'll be interesting to see. I will say, for as sort of many issues as there may have been at first with Fadi, he did a tremendous job. It's a big job, and I think he recognizes that he didn't fully understand what it meant to be part of this community and how the process really works. So and you can imagine somebody coming from the outside, anybody would probably have a very difficult time. And I think overall he really sets a very high bar.
Agreed.
I think we have actually covered most of the questions. I'll give it just one more moment to see if there are any final questions before I hand it back over to Gina. Are there any final questions? Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Gina.
Well, thank you, Lisa and Matt, for such a great presentation today. We appreciate you sharing your experiences as well as some best practices for the audience today. I'd like to also thank everyone for tuning in for their participation. Your questions always help draw out further information for those listening in. Now, as a reminder, we will be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the webinar's presentation slides and a recording within the next couple of days. So you can be on the lookout for that email. So that concludes our webinar for today. Thanks again for tuning in, and have a great day, everyone.